Jason Voorhees may have the larger body count, and Freddy Krueger may be the most inventive, but of all the on-screen death merchants, Michael Myers is the most influential. While Halloween wasn't the first slasher film, it was the first smash hit for the genre. Along with the Texas Chainsaw Massacre's Leatherface, Michael Myers ushered in the era of the masked, deformed boogeyman at the cinema and at video stores in the 80s and 90s. John Carpenter's classic took the simple concept of a masked man killing teenagers from a barely recognized subgenre to the face of horror in just a few years. Nearly all the icons of terror associated with the 1980s took inspiration, in one form or another, from the tale of an escaped serial killer terrorizing a small town in Illinois. Numerous ripoffs would follow in its wake, and no holiday or teenager was safe from the phenomenon. With its creator trying to change its premise to an anthology series and then quickly giving up, the series was rebooted and then re-rebooted, time and again with an increasingly large list of colorful characters involved in production. Including the 2018 movie, the franchise has been restarted no less than 5 times. In this video, we will examine the history of Halloween, the many behind-the-scenes fights, and what future the most recent franchise rebirth will bring. The roots of Halloween can be traced back to John Carpenter's 1976 film, Assault on Precinct 13. Independent producer Irwin Yablans saw the movie and really liked it. Sometime later, Carpenter and his then-girlfriend Deborah Hill went to the London Film Festival to attend a screening of the film. Soon after, they met financier Mustafa Akkad, Yablans' business partner and producer of the 1976 film The Message. Akkad and Yablans were looking to get into the mainstream American film market with their company, Compass International Pictures. Yablans saw massive talent in the 29-year-old Carpenter, and he had an idea he wanted to pitch. The idea was about an escaped psychopath who stalked babysitters. The concept was, in and of itself, not entirely original. Horror films like the Texas Chainsaw Massacre and The Town That Dreaded Sundown were somewhat similar to Yablans' pitch. He was quoted as saying, "I was thinking what would make sense in the horror genre, and what I wanted to do was make a picture that had the same impact as The Exorcist." Carpenter agreed to work on the project and started writing a script along with girlfriend Deborah Hill. Carpenter and Hill originally titled their draft The Babysitter Murders, but Yablans suggested setting it on Halloween night, and then further suggested the title just be Halloween. After doing some research, they found that there hadn't been a movie registered with that name at that time, so they jumped at the opportunity, and the idea seemed to fall into place. Carpenter and Hill's script was finished in just 10 days for time and convenience. Although initially being hesitant to take on the film due to its minuscule budget, the opportunity seemed too good to pass up. Mustafa Akkad finally decided to put up a budget of $300,000, just $200,000 more than the budget for Precinct 13. By design, Halloween was a low-budget production, and so it had to cut corners. One example was Carpenter hiring childhood friend and fellow aspiring filmmaker Tommy Lee Wallace as production designer, art director, location scout, and even co-editor. His biggest impact, however, was creating the iconic mask of the killer. When it came to the mask, there were a few concepts to choose from that were brought to Carpenter, one even being a clown mask. The one that stuck out the most just so happened to be a Captain Kirk mask, purchased for a paltry $1.98 and heavily modified. The sideburns were cut, the hair was teased, the eye holes were slightly widened, and it was painted white. Hill thought the mask was perfect, stating, "The idea was to make him almost humorless, faceless, this sort of pale visage that could resemble a human or not." The writing for the main antagonist who would wear the mask was primarily driven by an experience Carpenter had when he was in college. Carpenter once paid a visit to a mental institution in Kentucky. There, he saw a 12-year-old boy who sat and gave him a schizophrenic stare. Carpenter said of his encounter, "He had a real evil stare on his face. It was like looking at the devil. He was filled with hate, but he was mentally disturbed. It was frightening to see." For casting, they chose then-unknown actress Jamie Lee Curtis, daughter of Psycho star Janet Leigh and actor Tony Curtis, to play the lead heroine, Laurie Strode. Curtis was not the first choice for the role. That was Annie Lockhart, daughter of Lassie star June Lockhart. To add some legitimacy to the film, veteran star Donald Pleasance, best known for The Great Escape and for playing Ernst Stavro Blofeld in the James Bond film You Only Live Twice, was added to the cast. Pleasance was set to play Dr. Samuel Loomis, named after the character in Psycho. Loomis was a psychiatrist who was in pursuit of the villain of the film, a patient he had cared for the last 15 years, Michael Myers. The serial killer, mostly portrayed by future Last Starfighter and Major Payne director Nick Castle, was originally called The Shape, but was later given the name Michael Myers, which was the name of an English producer and friend of Yablans who had helped distribute Assault on Precinct 13. The entire film was shot in just 21 days, mostly in southern Pasadena, California. Securing distribution was difficult. An early cut of the film without any score was shown to all major American studios. They all declined. One studio head even remarked that the film wasn't scary at all. Carpenter quickly realized that a lot of tension and atmosphere is created through a film's score. With great haste, Carpenter, along with assistance by composer Dan Wyman, composed the film's famous piano score in just 3 days. With the musical soundtrack added, Compass International Pictures distributed the film to just 4 theaters in Kansas City, Missouri. Halloween opened on October 25, 1978 in Kansas City, Missouri. The film performed incredibly well, despite having next to no advertising ahead of release and relying mostly on word of mouth. It would go on to gross $70 million and would become a staple in theaters across the country every Halloween to this day. Reviews at first were somewhat mixed. Pauline Kael of The New Yorker wrote that it was incredibly basic and more childish than more sophisticated horror films. Others, like Tom Allen of The Village Voice, found it very effective and compared it to other horror classics such as Psycho and Night of the Living Dead. Roger Ebert went so far as to select it as one of the best films of 1978. A common point of praise was the film's sparse use of violence, which in the coming years would only make Halloween stand out in the sea of slasher flicks. Roger Ebert would champion the film at every opportunity, especially in comparison to the imitators that would follow.
There is a difference between good and scary movies and movies that systematically demean half the human race. There is a difference between movies which are violent but entertaining and movies that are gruesome and despicable. There is a difference between a horror movie and a freak show. And a good example of that is the fact that both of us gave favorable reviews to a very scary 1978 horror film named Halloween.
Years later, it would be widely considered a classic and a cinematic trendsetter. Like Texas Chainsaw Massacre, it helped create the concepts of the final girl, the masked killer, and many other eventual slasher movie cliches. But unlike Chainsaw, Halloween felt like a very polished and well-disciplined Hollywood film produced on a shoestring budget, and influenced generations of films and filmmakers yet to come. In the end, the amount of films inspired by Halloween numbered in the dozens, if not the hundreds. Slasher movies would have never become as big if a certain mass murderer hadn't escaped on a cold Halloween night. Halloween was a massive hit, and it came as a surprise to nearly everyone, not least of which the people who made it. So obviously, a sequel had to be made to capitalize on the popularity. But John Carpenter had other ideas. After a few years and many ripoffs, the producers and Hollywood, through the likes of Universal, were demanding a Halloween 2. In the meantime, movies like Friday the 13th had sprouted up and already had sequels of their own. Carpenter promised Yablans he'd do Halloween 2 if he could first make The Fog. Yablans agreed, and also said he'd make The Fog with Carpenter. Yablans then discovered that Carpenter, obviously not wanting to do Halloween 2, went to Embassy Pictures and made a deal for The Fog and Escape from New York. Unsurprisingly, Yablans was furious and took Carpenter to court. In the end, Carpenter was allowed to direct The Fog and Escape from New York with Embassy, but he was still obligated to write Halloween 2 for Yablans. Tommy Lee Wallace was approached to direct, but after reading the script, he turned it down. He found the script too much like the ripoffs that followed Halloween than the nearly bloodless, methodical tone and pace of the original. When asked by Midnight's Edge how he would have done it differently given the choice, he stated that he would have done something that more resembled H2O, with Laurie in college being stalked years later by Michael once again. Instead, newcomer director Rick Rosenthal would take the reins. Carpenter did write a draft of the script. He also made no illusions that he was not invested in the project, declaring at the time that this would be the last Halloween film he would work on. Irwin Yablans and Mustafa Akkad were heavily invested in the follow-up, adding up to $2.5 million to the budget compared to the original's $300,000. Their company, Compass International Pictures, wouldn't produce or distribute the film. After the success of Halloween, the major studios took notice. In the end, Dino De Laurentiis and Universal would produce and distribute the picture, along with securing a deal for a third movie. Compass International Pictures would no longer exist by the time the movie came out in 1981. By this time, slashers had become a very popular and lucrative film genre. While Halloween 2 was in production, films like Friday the 13th and MANIAC, despite being reviled by critics for their extreme violence, made millions. First-time director Rick Rosenthal was very likely aware of these films while directing, which led Halloween 2 to being noticeably more violent than the original. The movie opened on October 30th, 1981, and unlike the original, the reviews were by and large negative. Much of the criticism stemmed from the film's violence, especially when compared to the original. as well as the plot twist which revealed the heroine and the antagonist were related. Much like its horror peers, however, it didn't matter, as the movie grossed $25.5 million. With the storyline of Michael Myers seemingly wrapped up in a blaze of glory, was there going to be a future for the series? The deal with Universal included 2 films, and the 3rd film was already being made. The franchise's future was about to take a dramatic left turn and move away from the world of knife-wielding psychos. Despite being abundantly clear that they did not want to make another Halloween film, John Carpenter and Deborah Hill eventually agreed to write a 3rd movie on one very important condition. Halloween 2 had seemingly ended with the death of Michael Myers, and they intended to keep it that way. Carpenter and Hill wanted a sequel, with the only connection to the previous films being the theme of Halloween. Surprisingly, Universal agreed. Thus, production began on what was to become Halloween 3: Season of the Witch. The now reliable producer Irwin Ablins and Mustafa Akkad would once again foot the bill, despite not having a studio at the time. They recruited British writer Nigel Neal to write the script, known at the time for his Quatermass series, which Carpenter was a fan of. To direct, Carpenter wanted the Howling director Joe Dante. However, he was unavailable at the time due to working on another film. With Dante unavailable, the director chosen for the project was the man behind the creation of The Mask, Tommy Lee Wallace. Even though Wallace had turned down the opportunity to direct the first sequel, the idea of an anthology film intrigued him. This would be his first time directing, and he'd proved to have some talent behind the camera, directing future films like Fright Night 2 and the beloved It miniseries. To be a success, a lot more was riding on Halloween 3 than there was on Halloween 2. The risk of turning the entire series into an anthology could pay off in endless sequels with a new Halloween-themed film every year. Wallace further elaborated, "It is our intention to create an anthology out of the series, sort of along the lines of Night Gallery or The Twilight Zone, only on a much larger scale, of course." Trouble arose early on. Distributor Dino De Laurentiis reportedly said that he couldn't care less about the script and demanded more violence and gore to what was a fairly subdued feature. Writer Nigel Neal was displeased with these rewrites and later asked not to be credited. Wallace would later make several more corrections to the script. In what was a departure for the series, the director also cited the original Invasion of the Body Snatchers to be the main source of inspiration, not slasher films. For casting, Escape from New York actor Tom Atkins, who had also appeared in Carpenter's The Fog 2 years earlier, was cast as the lead. Future RoboCop actor Daniel O'Herlihy was chosen to be the film's very Irish antagonist. Carpenter again composed the soundtrack with the help of Halloween 2 and Escape from New York composer Alan Howarth. Most memorably, they created a Halloween jingle set to the tune of London Bridge is Falling Down.
Happy, happy Halloween, 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 happy, happy Halloween, silver shamrock.
The film was released on October 22, 1982, and the verdict was not good. Critics thrashed it, saying the plot was nonsensical and cheap. Fans were very upset that the sequel didn't feature Michael Myers. At the box office, the film was a hit, but nowhere near as big a hit as was expected. It grossed $14 million against a budget of $2.5 million. The film has now garnered something of a cult following, with many feeling it was misunderstood due to expectations. Regardless, the message at the time was clear: no Michael Myers, no money. Following the relatively disappointing Halloween 3 and in a time of uncertainty, Irwin Yablans left Compass International Pictures and the Halloween franchise as a whole. Mustafa Akkad, however, was very eager to continue the series, and he wanted Michael Myers back. In 1986, Compass International Pictures would return, now as Trancas International Films, an affiliate of Universal. The opportunity for a new film, however, wouldn't arise for a very long time. 4 long years would pass until Cannon Films approached John Carpenter with an offer. Cannon wanted him to write and direct Halloween 4. Carpenter said no to directing, but he wasn't against writing, with the caveat that he'd write what he wanted. Cannon agreed to his terms, and he quickly recruited Deborah Hill to produce, along with enlisting a writing partner in Dennis Etchison. Etchison had been the writer on the novelizations of Halloween 2 and 3. Once again, Carpenter wanted Joe Dante to direct, and again he wasn't available. Things seemed to be developing along until Akkad saw the script. He described it as too cerebral, and it didn't feature Michael Myers. Carpenter was furious, as he wanted nothing to do with Michael Myers anymore. Carpenter talked it over with Deborah Hill, and they made a fateful decision. They chose to sell the rights to Halloween to Akkad. Akkad then quickly threw out Etchison's script and started to look for a new writer. With the rights sold, John Carpenter and Deborah Hill swore never to work on Halloween again. Dwight H. Little, future director of Free Willy 2, was chosen to direct. Since Yablans left the series, Paul Freeman, who was primarily a television producer and a good friend of Akkad, agreed to produce. On February 25, 1988, fresh-faced writer Alan B. McElroy was picked to develop the script. At the same time, the crew tried to get as much of the original cast back as possible, with limited success. Jamie Lee Curtis was now a major Hollywood actress and had no interest in being in the series anymore. Donald Pleasence, however, was convinced to return to the role of Dr. Loomis, despite his character being blown up in Halloween 2. With Curtis out, McElroy devised a story involving Michael Myers coming back from near death to hunt Laurie Strode's daughter, Jamie Lloyd, named after Curtis, who had been adopted by another family after Laurie was said to have died in a car accident. McElroy had to work quickly, as the 1988 Writers Guild of America strike was set to begin on March 7th. After completing the script, the direction turned to casting. Melissa Joan Hart auditioned for the role of Laurie's daughter, before it ultimately went to 11-year-old actress Danielle Harris. Shooting began on April 11th and ended 41 days later. A change in the mask called for reshoots. The original mask can still be seen in the film, however, that wasn't the only change. McElroy wanted to take the series back in more ways than one. The writer was intent on making it more about tension than bloody slashing and over-the-top deaths that had become staples of the endless rip-offs of the original film. During a screening of a rough cut of the film, Little and Akkad decided the film wasn't gory enough. So they decided to bring in makeup artist and Friday the 13th Part 7 director and special effects artist John Carl Buechler to add more blood to the project. Halloween 4: The Return of Michael Myers was released on October 21, 1988 to tepid reviews, though Harris's performance was quite praised. Audiences, however, quite enjoyed it, and to this day it is considered one of the better sequels in the franchise. Money-wise, it was another hit, grossing $17.7 million against a $5 million budget. At the time, a very respectable box office for a slasher film. For all intents and purposes, Michael Myers was back again, and even in the era of Freddy Krueger and Jason Voorhees, he was thriving. A sequel was quickly greenlit, to no one's surprise. Halloween 5: The Revenge of Michael Myers was rushed into production and premiered less than a year after Halloween 4. The film received a negative reception from critics and did not fare well at the box office. With a similar budget to Halloween Part 4, around $5 million, an amount which was nearly more than twice the budget of most horror films at the time, the movie managed to barely eke out a gross of $11.6 million at the box office. Michael Myers' return appeared to be short-lived. Despite the movie ending on a mysterious cliffhanger, between the declining box office and harsh response from fans, Mustafa Akkad decided to put the entire franchise on hold. In 1990, then budding young writer Daniel Ferrantz, who was a fan of the series, wrote a screenplay for a follow-up to the fifth film. He gave it to Halloween 5 producer Ramsey Thomas, who loved it, and then set up a meeting with Akkad. The meeting reportedly went well, and it looked like production was going to start soon after. It, however, didn't. A series of legal battles had erupted over rights issues. There are very few details regarding the nature of the disputed claims, however, they caused delays in production time and time again. This ended when Dimension Films, a branch of the Harvey Weinstein-owned Miramax Corporation, owned by Buena Vista at the time, a subsidiary of the Walt Disney Company, bought the rights to the Halloween series. Dimension had been making a name for themselves with sci-fi, action, and horror genre films. They had also produced the 1992 film Hellraiser 3: Hell on Earth, which was distributed through Miramax. The studio decided that Michael Myers would be a great addition to their growing stable of properties. With Dimension producing the new film, Ferrant's script would be set aside, and work began on finding a new screenplay. By 1994, Akkad had gone through countless scripts, including one by Evil Dead 2 writer Scott Spiegel. Finally, Akkad went back to Ferrant's script and he was brought on board. Later, the Weinsteins would pick future Hellraiser Bloodlines director Joe Chappelle for the project. This after April Fool's Day director Joe Walton had dropped out. Many of the crew later said that director Joe Chappelle told them from the outset that he was not a fan of the Halloween films, and he was only involved on the project because it got him a paycheck and a 3-picture deal with Miramax. These claims are supported by the fact that his next 2 films, Phantoms and Takedown, were both Miramax releases. They would also be the last theatrical releases that he would direct. Paul Freeman also returned as producer, though this time with more power over the production. Ferrant's script was rewritten at least 10 times during the production period, with Ferrantz admitting that by the end, most of the third act wasn't his story. Once again, the cast would feature Donald Pleasence as Dr. Loomis. Despite being in ill health, the veteran actor signed on because he thought one of Ferrantz's drafts of the script was good. Danielle Harris, who was now 17, wasn't as easy to sign. The actress intended to return but ran into trouble with Dimension. Disputes over pay immediately ensued, and ended as quickly as they began. The studio only wanted to pay the actress $1,000 and ended the talks the moment she tried to negotiate. Actress J.C. Brandy was chosen to replace Harris. Since her character Jamie was killed off early on, Ferrens believed the film needed a new male and female lead. The female lead came in the form of actress Marianne Hagen, despite Harvey Weinstein reportedly believing that she was too thin for the role. For the male lead, Ferrens wanted to bring back the character of Tommy Doyle, the child Laurie Strode babysat for in the first film. The studio wanted the original actor Brian Andrews to reprise the role, but he reportedly couldn't be found. Instead, they settled on a then unknown actor named Paul Rudd. Rudd would gain acclaim in the interim by co-starring in the 1995 hit Clueless, though Halloween: The Curse of Michael Myers was filmed before and released after his breakout role. Originally played by Robert Phelan, Dr. Terrence Wynn was a character who first appeared in the original Halloween. Pending his return in the film, expanding his role and revealing him as the infamous Man in Black, Ferrens imagined horror legend Christopher Lee in the role. In the end, he had to settle for Lethal Weapon actor Mitchell Ryan. At one point or another, a wide range of other popular faces were nearly cast in the film. At one point, actress model Denise Richards was in talks to play a minor role, but was dismissed by producers due to her being considered to be quote-unquote nothing but boobs. A shock jock character was written with self-proclaimed king of all media Howard Stern in mind. However, he turned down the role to focus on his own feature film, Private Parts. By the time filming began, and likely as the result of a lawsuit, the movie had 3 production companies behind it: Dimension, Trancas International Films, formerly known as Compass International Pictures, and NIGHTFALL Productions. The entire shoot was plagued by infighting, while tensions continually remained high on set. This was due to the 3 production houses and the screenwriter all having different visions of what the film should look like. On the set, very few people could be relied upon to do their job properly. Reportedly, director Chappelle followed Dimension's every word and had no independent thought of his own. Along with Freeman, he allegedly rewrote the entire ending on set, throwing Ferrens' script to the side. Freeman was supposedly even worse to work with. On occasion, he would send the entire crew home, delete entire shots because he felt like doing so, rewrite dialogue and action scenes, and even went so far as to personally direct new shots and supervise post-production. These actions greatly angered Miramax, who directly took over production and demanded they go back and fix it. In early 1995, with the film shot and edited, the movie was test screened for a group of 14-year-olds. When the screening ended, the audience showed great displeasure at the ending, mostly for leaning so heavily on Celtic rituals and cults. As a result, Dimension moved the film back into production, ordering another round of reshoots to rework the ending. Sadly, the reshoots would not include one key actor. On February 5, 1995, Hollywood legend and Halloween franchise ambassador Donald Pleasence passed away at the age of 75 from heart failure, with his final role being the one he was most synonymous with. This would put the production into a difficult situation before a single frame of film could be reshot. But that wasn't the only problem. Dimension also wanted the entire film re-edited for a more flashy cinematic style that Ferrens thought appealed more to what he called the MTV crowd. Among the edits, the film's score was to be entirely redone and remixed, much to Alan Howarth's objections. Howarth, who had been a composer with the series since he helped John Carpenter on Halloween 2, quit the film and the franchise. Another point of contention was Pleasence's role in the film. Allegedly, Chappelle or Miramax didn't like the late Pleasence much as an actor and found him boring, so the reshoots removed as much footage of him as possible. The reshoots and edits caused an outrage at NIGHTFALL Productions, who preferred the original cut of the film. But before a 6th film would hit cinemas, Michael Myers would find himself in court once again. NIGHTFALL took Dimension to court over the different versions of the film. Ultimately, Dimension won the dispute, and their cut became the theatrical release. By the time teasers and trailers were being prepped, the crew came to realize that the movie had no official title. The first teaser that had been released in the middle of production was titled Halloween 666, The Origin of Michael Myers. Much like the release date, that title would also change. Ferrens claimed the title was taken from several scripts, including his own. Footage was even taken from various edits during production. When Akkad realized there was no official name, he asked Ferrens for one. Sarcastically, he suggested the title, The Curse of Michael Myers, due to the extreme production troubles. Akkad took it at face value, and the fitting subtitle hence came to be. Despite no reported connection, years later, Ferrens would realize that the series now had the same subtitles as films in the Pink Panther franchise: Return, Revenge, and Curse. The quality, he thought, which is even below that standard. After a difficult production, the film was released on September 29, 1995. The reaction was visceral. It was torn apart by critics and audiences with extreme prejudice, calling it cheap, nonsensical, poorly written, and an insulting capstone to Pleasance's career. The box office returns were also dire, grossing only $15.1 million against a $5 million budget, only slightly better than Halloween 5. Most of the cast and crew would later disown the film, putting much of the blame on the studios, producers, and director Chappelle. Over the years, the movie achieved notoriety among fans for having several different cuts, especially in the rise of file sharing on the internet. One of those was Nightfall's preferred cut. It became one of the most widely sought after and downloaded alternate movie cuts. Commonly called the production or producer's cut, it was known to exist for several years until the early 2000s. Though it could have originated from a variety of sources, it is rumored that someone working at Dimension Films managed to find a screener of the original work print and leaked it on the internet. Though the quality was very poor, it was generally considered to be a better cut of the movie. Fans have also used the original source to cobble together a more watchable version. Even so, it is still not a beloved film due to significant parts of the story remaining the same, among which was providing more evidence that Michael fathered his own great-nephew. This version of the film wouldn't see an official release until 2014. Screenwriter Ferrens remained surprised that people cared enough about the producer's cut that it would actually get released. To the general film audience, however, the slasher film genre was dead. Halloween 6 had been the final nail in the coffin, with the 90s seeing diminishing returns on horror films across the board. Though it wouldn't be for long, and of course, Michael would strike again. Not more than a year after the failure of Halloween 6, and though believed to be as dead as most teenagers in the films, the slasher genre was resurrected by Wes Craven's runaway sleeper hit, Scream. The horror parody was a critical darling and made over $100 million domestically, which then was not only unheard of for a horror film, but abnormal for most movies. Scream also made $70 million at the foreign box office. Its success led to revivals of other popular slasher characters, so Michael Myers was no exception. Scream's screenwriter Kevin Williamson wrote a story for Halloween 7. The script got the ball rolling, and soon enough the gang was slowly coming back together. Paul Freeman was back to produce, along with Mustafa Akkad returning as executive producer. Dimension, Trancas International, and NIGHTFALL Productions also returned to produce and distribute, though they intended to be less hands-on than on Halloween 6. Williamson's script, however, would never make it to the screen. Robert Zappia and Matt Greenberg would be credited as writers of the film and would heavily alter the original script. Controversially, they would change the continuity from a follow-up to a reboot. Though Williamson wasn't officially credited, he did help write some of the character dialogue. He also wrote the manner in which Michael would come back if the movie was a hit, something that would actually be filmed before Halloween 8. Though the fans were not pleased at the breaking of continuity, they didn't remain angry for long, as the film managed to bring back its original star. Despite saying she was above such films, Jamie Lee Curtis promised to return to the franchise that had launched her career. Curtis also wanted to reunite with John Carpenter as director, and at first he agreed, until he mentioned his fee was going to be $10 million. Carpenter claimed his high asking price was because he never received any revenue from the original Halloween, something that had been a point of contention between Carpenter and Akkad for nearly 25 years. Akkad refused to pay his fee, so Carpenter quickly dropped out from directing. In his place, Akkad brought in Friday the 13th Part 2 and 3 director Steve Miner. The original working title was Halloween 7: The Revenge of Laurie Strode, but it was eventually changed to emphasize the 20th anniversary of the franchise. Thus, the title was changed to the occasionally mocked Halloween H2O 20 years later. The film was released on August 5, 1998, and it fared far better than the previous sequels had. Much praise was given to Jamie Lee Curtis's triumphant return and for a satisfying ending to the film and, for the time being, the series. It was also a major hit as well, grossing $85 million against a budget of $17 million. With just a year after crashing and burning, Halloween was back in the eyes of horror fans. However, that wouldn't last long. Following the success of Halloween H2O, plans were already on the drawing board for a follow-up. During the production of H2O, Jamie Lee Curtis explicitly wanted the film to be the end of the series. This wasn't actually possible, as Mustafa Akkad had a contractual clause that literally prevented Michael Myers from dying. Curtis almost left production until she made a deal with Akkad. She would return for a sequel so long as there was no hint of one in H2O, which he did fulfill. Former Halloween director Dwight H. Little was asked to direct, but he refused. So they asked Halloween 2 director Rich Rosenthal to return, which he did. The producers wanted Danielle Harris to return to the franchise, but like Little, she refused. They did, however, get rapper Busta Rhymes in a major role. Though Curtis had agreed to return, she was very unenthusiastic about the project from the get-go. She reached a point where she wanted to drop out again unless she was killed off early in the film. Hoping not to lose her, they conceded to her demands. Just like H2O, the title of the movie was changed during production. Originally, it was to be titled Halloween Homecoming, but the producers believed it was best to emphasize Michael was alive again. The movie therefore became known as Halloween Resurrection. Its original release date was also changed from September 21st, 2001 to April 19th of 2002, and eventually July. This was because Dimension Pictures wanted the film to be significantly stronger than the original cut, so a large amount of reshoots were done in the fall of 2001. The movie was released on July 12th of 2002, 3 months after Jason X, the proverbial end of the Friday the 13th series. Resurrection quickly became the equivalent for Halloween, as the critics came with sharpened knives. It received some of the worst reviews in the franchise's history for nearly every one of its cinematic choices, from Blair Witch Project-inspired found footage to the inexplicable martial arts scene with Busta Rhymes fighting Michael Myers. Fan opinion of the film matched the critics. Yet despite the thrashing, the movie was still a hit. It made $37.6 million on a $13 million budget. Despite being a success, a choice was made not to continue the series for the time being, most likely due to the negative reception. The franchise went into stasis once again and wouldn't return for another 5 years. When it emerged, it was in a completely different shape, continuity, and with a different creative mind. Over the 5-year hiatus, Mustafa Akkad would try to revive the franchise in some form or another. His attempts would end prematurely and tragically. On November 9th of 2005, Akkad and his daughter were killed in the Amman bombings terrorist attack in Jordan. He would leave behind a mixed legacy, but he was undeniably important in the creation of the franchise as a whole. His son, Malik, would later assume his father's role as producer. Earlier in the year, series co-creator Deborah Hill had died from her battle with cancer on March 7th, 2005. 7 months later, Dimension Pictures announced that Halloween was back in an entirely new form. The project would be helmed by director-musician Rob Zombie, best known for directing House of a Thousand Corpses and The Devil's Rejects. This was to be his project. He would write, direct, and produce the entire film. Before Dimension went public with the news, Zombie told John Carpenter that a new film was coming and it was going to be a remake. Carpenter simply responded, "Make it your own." He would later admit that the film was going to be part prequel and part remake. Much like H2O, it would disregard all previous film entries, making it the 4th official reboot of the franchise. Zombie planned to completely reinvent Michael Myers, as he believed many of the horror icons, from Jason to Pinhead, had become too familiar to audiences and were no longer scary. He wanted Michael to be relatable and charismatic, still a psychopath, but a more realistic version of one. In December of 2006, Zombie chose then 10-year-old Daeg Faerch to play the young Michael Myers. He would later add veteran British actor Malcolm McDowell as the new Dr. Samuel Loomis, along with Scout Taylor Compton as Laurie Strode. Zombie did get one original series cast member back in the form of the now 30-year-old Danielle Harris. The film's production came and went without a hitch, a far cry from many of the previous films. It was released on August 31st, 2007 to mostly negative critical reviews. Faerch and McDowell were lauded, but most critics believed that a Halloween remake was unnecessary. Fans were mixed. Some agreed with the critics, others enjoyed the vastly different take on the iconic antagonist. The film performed fairly well, grossing $80.2 million by the end of its run on a $15 million budget. Though polarizing, Rob Zombie's Halloween did breathe new life back into the franchise that now resembled its villain, always killed, but always coming back. There was hope for the series again, and same as before, it would crash and burn. 2 years would pass until Rob Zombie's Halloween 2 would be released on August 28, 2009. Zombie had been exhausted by the filmmaking process for Halloween and didn't want to return, but did in the end. Later he claimed that he felt he was no longer bound to Carpenterisms and was free to do whatever he wanted, and it showed. The movie received significant pushback from audiences and critics alike, claiming it was silly, dull, and rushed. It was also nowhere near as profitable as the first remake, making only $39.3 million with a budget of $15 million. Despite the lower box office numbers, Dimension was keen on continuing the series. In 2011, they announced Halloween 3D with a release date of October 26, 2012. Rob Zombie would not return as director, though a replacement was not announced. Jason X writer Todd Farmer and My Bloody Valentine director Patrick Lussier were hired to write, but later dropped out due to their commitments on the abandoned Hellraiser remake. After their departure, the sequel languished in development hell until quietly being cancelled after no progress had been made. In February of 2015, Saw 4 writers Patrick Melton and Marcus Dunstan were reportedly writing a new Halloween film. In June, the Weinstein Company reported to be moving ahead with the film, now titled Halloween Returns, with Dunstan directing. It was to be a direct sequel to Halloween 2, and not the small armada of sequels and timelines past that point. In October, Malek Akkad announced that it was being postponed due to the need to improve the overall quality. This decision would prove to be fateful. As of December 2015, Dimension would forfeit the rights to the Halloween series pending the failure of Halloween Returns to make it into production. The film was immediately canceled, and the rights went up for grabs. On May 24th of 2016, it was announced to the horror world that the rights to Halloween were now owned by Miramax, specifically Tariq Akkad, son of the late Mustafa Akkad. The same day, Blumhouse announced they were co-financing a brand new Halloween film with Miramax. John Carpenter quickly said that he was joining the film as an executive producer, feeling it was time to return to the franchise he had helped create nearly 40 years prior. Carpenter said in an interview with Rotten Tomatoes, "I talked about the Halloweens for a long time, the sequels. I haven't seen all of them, but finally it occurred to me, well, if I'm just flapping my gums here, why don't I try to make it as good as I can? So stop throwing rocks from the sidelines and get in there and try to do something positive." After the rights were acquired, Adam Wingard, director of The Guest, nearly landed in the director's chair before backing out. Pineapple Express director David Gordon Green and Eastbound and Down star Danny McBride mentioned in February of 2017 that they were going to be writing the film with Green personally directing. Much like the attempted Halloween Returns, the new movie, now simply titled Halloween, was going to ignore the many sequels. The difference this time was it was going to be a direct sequel to the original 1978 classic and nothing else. Carpenter specifically mentioned that Michael Myers would be taken back to his roots as a mysterious killer, far from his tragic portrayal in the Rob Zombie films, which Carpenter openly said he didn't like. In September of 2017, it was reported that Jamie Lee Curtis was returning as Laurie Strode for the 5th time. The writers were at first unsure if she would be coming back, but apparently she was so impressed with the script that she couldn't turn it down. On December 20th of 2017, another old cast member said he was returning to Haddonfield. Nick Castle, the original Michael Myers, was coming back to the series 40 years later, along with stuntman James Courtney. The cast had now grown to include such faces as Archer's Judy Greer and No Way Out's Will Patton. Danielle Harris also nearly returned, but the studio chose not to go with her. Filming began on January 13, 2018, and ended February 19th. After a screening on June 11, 2018, the film went through a series of reshoots. Carpenter later confirmed during production that he would be doing a unique score for the film, the first since Halloween 3. Halloween 2018 is the 11th film in the series, and while at one point Carpenter referred to the movie as being a true finale, Danny McBride pretty much said the opposite when he alluded that the sequel would be shot back to back, something which clearly didn't happen. What did happen, without giving away spoilers, is that the movie ended on a note which could be interpreted as definitive in the event that the film underperformed, but which still left the door open for further sequels if the movie should prove to be successful. As it turned out, the movie opened in the vicinity of $80 million in its domestic opening weekend, which is the biggest opening in the history of the franchise. Given that the movie had a reported production budget in the $10 million range, the sequel McBride referred to may happen yet. More than that, other studios are sure to take notice of these numbers, and they may wish to bring back their own dormant franchises. We have heard rumors that a Hellraiser reboot is in the early stages of development in the hands of the new franchise owners following the demise of the Weinstein Company. MGM has announced a Child's Play remake, and Legendary is trying to revive Leatherface for a 3rd time. Numbers like these may be a powerful incentive to find a way to bring back Friday the 13th and A Nightmare on Elm Street as well. All we can say for sure at this point is that Michael Myers will never die, and Haddonfield will never sleep soundly again when the autumn season arrives. Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If you like this video, then please click the subscribe button, and don't forget to click the bell icon to be notified for all the latest uploaded content. Due to recent changes to YouTube's monetization policies, we'd also like to ask you to please consider supporting Midnight's Edge and its sister channel Midnight's Edge After Dark through Patreon. As thanks for their support, patrons will receive early notifications of mini-documentaries, special behind-the-scenes Making of the Edge videos, bloopers, outtakes, lost episodes, and more. You can support the channel for as little as $1 a month. Be sure to check back for news and analysis on the corporate politics behind your favorite genre movies, as well as updates and discussion here at Midnight's Edge.